Chairman, dear colleagues and friends from across the world. We are very, very happy to have you here today. My name is Maria. And on behalf of the Wastewater Integrated Monitoring Initiative, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this session on the current status of water and sanitation on our planet. And we are very pleased to have all of you here. And with this new format of the World Water Week, we are specifically pleased to have been able to invite all our country focal points for SDG6 monitoring. Thanks so much to all of you for joining. And first, just a few practical notes. We are offering simultaneous translation to Spanish and French. And to listen to this presentation, you need to download an application if you haven't already done so. And you will then be listening to the session through your mobile phone while still using your computer to watch the session and to interact with us. And to be able to interact with us, we ask you to please use, I'm going to show the screen now. Please use the Pathable page for this session. There's a function here which is called chat, where you can post any comments and questions, and we will try to respond to them as soon as possible. To test this out, please introduce yourself right away so we know who you are. During the discussion and later in the session, we will also you will be able to take the floor. You do so by raising your hand in Zoom. I will come back to this later. And during the session, to keep you alert, we have also prepared a few quiz questions. You find them here under pause. To test these ones, maybe you can start with the first one, which is your favorite SDG target. We can see if it's working that way, and it's of course just for fun. But please also take a look at the 3 quiz questions that we have prepared. And as we proceed with the presentation, you will be able to respond to these questions. Yes, so back to the presentation. I will start by giving a brief introduction of water and sanitation monitoring and reporting in the context of the 2030 agenda. And after that, I will hand over to the various UN agencies to give a very, very brief status update on the various SDG6 targets and indicators. After that, we would like to discuss these findings with you and respond to any questions that you may have. And then finally, we will be launching 7 new reports, which present a detailed view of the current status of SDG6. And on this slide, we have also noted down our objectives with this session and also with the indicator reports. And we don't have much time, so let's just start. First, to lay out the land. I believe that all of you are very much aware of Sustainable Development Goal 6 on ensuring sustainable water and sanitation for all by 2030. And to track progress towards this goal, UN member states have identified 11 global indicators, the SDG6 indicators, and also committed to report data on these indicators. They are looked after by various UN agencies, the custodian agencies, and they have prepared methodologies for monitoring them. And they are also regularly reaching out to countries to request data, and also to support with various capacity building activities. And of course, also to report on global progress towards the indicators. And the Wastewater Integrated Monitoring Initiative for SDG6, IMI SDG6, it brings together all these agencies to capture synergies across the indicators and also to enable more efficient outreach to countries. And at the national level, IMI SDG6 is also encouraging, cross-sectoral collaboration and integration of data. IMI, S36, all the agencies, of course, bring their own resources to this, but the joint efforts wouldn't be possible unless we had our very generous donors to fund the activities. The ultimate reason for collecting data on water and sanitation is, of course, to help policy and decision makers to take informed action. So, for example, at the local level, data can help wastewater treatment plant operator to take day-to-day decisions, or a water basin organization to allocate water resources across sectors. And at the national or higher levels, data are essential to communicate progress or the lack of progress. And this is very important to ensure accountability and also to attract commitment and investments, both nationally and also internationally. And as you see in this image to the right, it's also a central component of achieving the 2030 agenda. What we water experts need to think about is how we convert this data into information that policy and decision makers can act on. Another central aspect is to bring together data from across sectors to enable a integrated management. So, for example, urban planning or energy or agriculture, to bring it together. Just like, so this image, I think it's very nice to convey these messages, how, bits and pieces of sectoral data can be analyzed and structured into something that means something, and something that's also easier to communicate to people. So in this case, we see how this duck emerges. The data that we will present today, it's coming from countries mainly. And last year, despite the COVID pandemic, UN agencies reached out to their country focal points to ask them for data. And we really, despite all problems and the challenges of having to cancel face-to-face activities and replace them with online work, and despite country focal points working from home, we could see that the reporting was actually really great. If you look at this map, you can see how many indicators how many of the SDG6 global indicators that each country is reporting on. And the average number of global indicators reported on by UN member states, it was 7.0 in 2019, and in 2021, it's now 8.2. So it's actually, it's been a great experience, and we applaud all the country focal points for all these dedicated efforts. And I hope you can all use the hand clapping tool in Zoom to show your appreciation. However, data gaps do remain, especially for those indicators that rely on in situ monitoring networks. So, for example, water quality and aquifer data. And I mean, as the country focal points know more than anyone, this is really something that requires long-term investment, financial capital investments, and support, both internal and external support to achieve this. So that's why we really call on everyone out there to support us in these capacity building efforts and help countries perhaps bring data from different private sector, public sector, academia, and civil society to just get it all on the table. Finally, we want to raise awareness. And I will soon hand over to the different agencies to give you a more detailed view. but just to note that as we already saw in March this year in this summary progress update, unfortunately, the world remains off track to meet SDG 6 by 2030. And in some cases, progress needs to speed up by 4 times to be able to reach this. And yes, so please when we start, please also take a look at these quiz questions to see if you can respond to them. And if it's too quick, there's a lot of numbers. You can also look at the reports themselves. And with that, I hand over to Rick to start off with the target 6.1 on drinking water. Over to you, Rick.
Thank you, Maria. Hello, everybody. My name is Rick Johnston, and I work at WHO headquarters in Geneva. I co-lead the WHO-UNICEF Joint Monitoring Program, or JMP, which is responsible for global monitoring of progress on SDG targets 6.1 and 6.2 on drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene. The JMP is co-led by my colleague Tom Slaymaker at UNICEF, who unfortunately isn't able to join today due to some technical difficulties with the Pathable platform. So I'm going to present on behalf of both WHO and UNICEF. Next slide, please. So SDG target 6.1 aims to achieve universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all by 2030. And the global indicator that we use to track progress is the proportion of population using safely managed drinking water services. And a safely managed service means having an improved water source that meets 3 criteria. The drinking water should be accessible on the premises, it should be available when needed, and free from contamination. And the latest estimates just published in July of this year show that 26% of the world's population, that's 2 billion people, lacked safely managed drinking water services in 2020. And furthermore, the current rate of progress needs to be quadrupled to meet the global target. Next slide, please. The JMP progress update shows that many countries still do not have enough national data to report on the SDG global indicator, as indicated in gray on this map. In 2020, national estimates were available for 138 countries, areas, and territories, representing 45% of the global population. Data on accessibility, availability, and quality of drinking water are more widely available for middle and high-income countries. Next slide, please. We use service ladders to track the population using safely managed services, that's in dark blue, also basic services in light blue, and limited services in yellow, as well as those using unimproved sources or surface water, shown in orange. And estimates for safely managed services are available for 5 out of the 8 SDG regions, but current trends suggest that none of these regions is currently on track to achieve universal access by 2030. And globally, 771 million people still lacked even a basic drinking water service in 2020. 8 out of 10 of those lived in rural areas, and nearly half lived in least developed countries. Next slide. Now, since 2000, billions of people have gained access to drinking water services. However, these rates of progress will not be sufficient to achieve the SDG target of universal access by 2030. In fact, we would need to double the current rates of progress just to make sure that everyone has basic services, and the rate would need to be quadrupled to get to universal access for safely managed services for all. So of course, this will require a substantial increase in current levels of investment in drinking water services. Next slide, please. SDG target 6.2 aims to achieve access to adequate and equitable sanitation and hygiene for all, and to end open defecation by 2030, paying special attention to the needs of women and girls and those in vulnerable situations. We have 2 global indicators for this target, one for sanitation and one for hygiene. Next slide. The global indicator that we use to track progress on sanitation is the proportion of the population using safely managed sanitation services. And here, a safely managed service means using an improved sanitation facility that is not shared with other households, and where the excreta produced are either treated and disposed of in situ or are removed and treated off-site. The latest estimates show that 46% of the world's population, 3.6 billion people, lack safely managed sanitation services, and 494 million people still practiced open defecation in 2020. So to meet the global target by 2030, the current rate of progress needs to be quadrupled. Next slide. The progress report shows that many countries still do not have sufficient national data to report on the SDG global indicator, though the situation is a little bit better than for drinking water. In 2020, national estimates were available for 120 countries, areas, and territories, representing 81% of the global population. Also really interesting to note that in 2020, for the first time, more people were using on-site sanitation facilities, such as septic tanks and improved latrines, than had sewer connections. But while most countries have data on treatment of wastewater from households connected to sewers, very few have data on the treatment and disposal of waste from septic tanks and pit latrines. So that remains a major data gap. Next slide, please. We use similar service ladders to track the population using safely managed services in dark green, basic services, light green, and limited services in yellow, as well as those using unimproved facilities and practicing open defecation in orange. Estimates for safely managed services are available for 7 out of the 8 SDG regions, but none of them are currently on track to achieve universal access by 2030. 1.7 billion people still lack even basic sanitation in 2020, and among these, 2/3 lived in rural areas, nearly half of them in sub-Saharan Africa. And that includes the 494 million people who still practiced open defecation. Next slide. Since 2000, billions of people have gained access to sanitation services as well, but again, those rates of progress will not be sufficient to achieve the SDG target. The world is on track to eliminate open defecation by 2030, as you see in orange, but to get universal access to even basic services would require doubling rates of progress, and for safely managed services, again, it would be a 4-fold increase in the current rate of progress. Next slide, please. Now, the second indicator for target 6.2 is the proportion of the population with basic hygiene services, which means having access to a hand washing facility with soap and water at home. And the latest data show that in 2020, nearly 1/3 of the world's population, that's 29%, or 2.3 billion people, lacked the means to wash hands with soap and water at home. And this makes it very hard for people to apply one of the most basic measures to protect themselves against infectious diseases, including COVID-19. Next slide. Most of the data on hand washing comes from household surveys in low and middle income countries. High income countries don't have as many household surveys, and when they do, they typically don't ask about water, sanitation, and hygiene, as universal coverage is presumed. So in the JNP report published a few months ago, national estimates were available for only 79 countries, areas, and territories, representing just over half of the global population. And you can see from the map that data were most commonly available in sub-Saharan Africa, where coverage rates tend to be lower. Next slide. The hygiene service ladder includes basic hygiene services in purple, but also those with a hygiene facility but lacking soap or water, which we call limited hygiene services, that's in yellow, and those with no hand washing facilities at all, shown in orange. Estimates for basic hygiene were available for 4 of the SDG regions, including Northern Africa and Western Asia, which is currently the only region on track to achieve universal access before 2030. Next slide, please. In our 2021 report, for the first time, we had enough data on hand washing to show trends at the global level over the past 5 years. And we can see that if current rates of progress continue, the world will reach 78% coverage with basic hygiene services by 2030, leaving 1.9 billion people without basic hygiene. So just as for safely managed drinking water and sanitation services, the rate of progress would need to quadruple in order to reach universal coverage by 2030. So while there need to be accelerations in drinking water and sanitation, the same is true of hygiene and hand washing. Let me turn now to SDG target 6.3 on the next slide. This target reads to, by 2030, improve water quality by reducing pollution, eliminating dumping, and minimizing release of hazardous chemicals and nutrients and materials, halving the proportion of untreated wastewater, and substantially increasing recycling and safe reuse globally. Now, this target has two indicators: the proportion of wastewater safely treated, which is monitored by UN Habitat, WHO, and UNSD, and then the proportion of bodies of water with good ambient water quality, for which the UN Environment Program is the custodian agency. Next slide. So the first of these indicators then is the proportion of domestic and industrial wastewater flows safely treated. And this target is about the generation and treatment of all kinds of wastewater, but as the indicator suggests, we can separately analyze industrial and domestic or household wastewater flows. UN Habitat leads on the analysis of total and industrial wastewater data, while WHO is the lead agency for domestic wastewater. And there's actually more data available on domestic wastewater, in part because we use data from household surveys, like the JMP does for targets 6.1 and 6.2. The main takeaway statistic for household wastewater from the report is that in 2020, almost half, about 44%, of wastewater generated by households was not safely treated before discharge. Now let me turn the floor over to my colleague at UN Habitat, Graham Alabaster, to talk about the data on total wastewater and on industrial wastewater. Graham, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rick. Well, hello everybody. I'm Graham Alabaster, the Chief of the Geneva Office of UN Habitat, and I'm the focal point within UN Habitat for this particular indicator. This indicator uses a slightly different method from the domestic wastewater, and it relies on using reported data to national statistic offices and is extracted from the UNSD UNEP data questionnaire. So our co-custodian UNSD, of course, provide us with a lot of this information. So the picture actually is really rather bleak. And the message here, if we look at total wastewater flows safely treated, and the latest year we have is 2015, is that only 42 countries in the world actually report on this indicator, which is equivalent to around 20% of the world's population. As you can see, the ranges here, there are several countries in the developed region, which of course safely treat most of their wastewater, but of course this drops off rapidly. Could we have the next slide, please? The next slide regards exclusively industrial wastewater, and we're able to extract this and disaggregate this data from the questionnaire based on the ISIC classic codes for industry. And if you look at the situation with industrial wastewater, it's actually even worse than total wastewater, in that only 14 countries have reported on this indicator, which represents a very small proportion of the world's population. So, I mean, the important thing about this is if you take these figures together, that at least 70% of total and industrial wastewater is discharged not safely treated. So the reality is that that figure of 70% is actually much higher, because the countries who've reported during this period are only from the more developed regions. So we have a very, very long way to go in order to get a full picture of the breakdown of wastewater. So could we have the next slide, please? Or I'm handing back to Rick to give you a final synopsis of the household wastewater. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. And because we can draw on data available for household surveys, we could produce estimates for safely treated household wastewater in 2020 from 128 countries, areas, and territories, representing 80% of the global population. And you can see on the map, there are 62 countries, nearly half of the countries with estimates, where less than half of household wastewater was safely treated before discharge. Those are shown in orange and red. And you can see that unsafe discharges of wastewater are found all around the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Latin America and the Caribbean, Eastern Europe, and Southern and Eastern Asia. This, of course, leads to deterioration of ambient water quality, which is covered by the next indicator, 6.3.2. Let me now pass over to Stuart Warner from the UN Environment Program, which is the custodian agency for this indicator.
Good stuff. Thanks very much, Rick. This is Stuart Warner from UNEP with the update for indicator 632. So this indicator, it monitors the proportion of bodies of water with good ambient water quality. And these bodies of water can be a section of a river, a lake, or an aquifer. And good water quality is defined by measurements of parameters that reflect pressures on water quality that are relevant globally. On the next slide, you see the global map that shows the latest information that we have collected from 96 countries. These data show that there are many water bodies that are still in good condition. And in fact, of all the water bodies assessed, 60% were classified as good. And this is one of our main messages. Protection is easier than restoration. So efforts to protect these water bodies should be initiated now. On the next slide, you see a chart where each country is represented by a dot. This chart shows that both good and poor water quality were reported in all world regions. And an analysis of the data submitted showed that in most cases, it was nutrients that were the main cause for poor water quality. And the two main sources of nutrients are runoff from agriculture and untreated wastewater effluent. So by improving farming management practices and the rate and type of wastewater treatment, they're essential if water quality is to be improved. On the next slide, one of the key findings from the recent data drive was that monitoring and assessment capacity is very much lower in poorer countries. These countries used far fewer measurements and reported on far fewer water bodies. In fact, of the 76,000 water bodies that were assessed in 2020, only 1% were from the 20 poorest countries. So using this limited reporting from some countries and an assessment of monitoring capacity in those countries that did not report, we estimate approximately 3 billion people and their livelihoods are at risk. This is because the health of the water bodies and the freshwater ecosystems that they depend on are unknown. This information should be available to all, and not just to those from countries with the capacity to collect this information. In terms of action, a first step is to put policies in place to build the monitoring and assessment capacity globally. So this includes expanding national monitoring programs, establishing suitable environmental water quality
Well, okay, I guess it's my turn. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. I'm Riccardo Biancalani. I'm the coordinator of the Integrated Monitoring Initiative for SDG 6 at FAO. And here we'll be presenting the two indicators for the target 6.4. Next, please. Next slides. Thank you. Okay, the indicator 641, no, the previous one. The indicator 641 for water use efficiency, we have seen in the past few years, since 2015, an increase globally of 10% on the water use efficiency of the use of the water. We will now have a look more in detail, so please next. Here we can see in the world, the green countries where we have got an increase in the past 4 years. In red, those countries where we had a decrease. And we can see on the global scale that there is fundamentally not much of a pattern in how countries are performing, if you want. But at the same time, we can see that most of countries have got an increase in this. But now we will see, we try to define some pattern nonetheless. Next slide. Here we have these lines representing the changes of the water use efficiency over the past years. And we can note the black line in the middle is the worldwide trend. And we can see here that while most areas of the world, most regions are actually increasing their water use efficiency, we have a couple of regions with more, things are more complicated, one being Latin America and the other Sub-Saharan Africa. And now we will have another view in more detail again, Please, next slide. Okay, here we can notice how things are. We have the value added produced by the economy globally, and in red, and in yellow we have the water use efficiency. We see here how the water use efficiency has increased, as we said, but at the same time we see that this is increasing less than the global gross value added. And this is, of course, the main point. The water using efficiency is increasing, but still the water withdrawals that are performed in order to produce economic value is also increasing, and is not increasing enough to overcome the increase of the gross value added. So fundamentally, we would be on track when and if the yellow line will overpass the red line and will come above the red line. Next, please. The 642 for water stress, we have 2.3 billion people in that, and living in countries that experience water stress, of which 733 million live in high and critically water stressed countries, which now we will see in the next slide. Okay, here we see the at the regional level. So at regional level, we can see the two red lines representing the two regions with the highest comprehensively water stress, which is Central Asia and Southern Asia, Northern Africa and Western Asia. And in yellow, the region that comes immediately after those in terms of high water stress, which is Eastern Asia and Southeastern Asia. Now, this gives an idea on which regions may be more concerned by the problems due to water stress, but we can see in the next slide here we can see at country level, and we can see how we begin to perceive a sort of water stress belt that we could define from Western North Africa to Central Asia and possibly East Asia. But this remains for the moment in this map, we can still see, but with some missing parts apparently. And one of the main feature of this report is given in the next slide. Here we have the level of water stress, not by country, but by basin of the major rivers. And here, I would say that here we can see even better the extent of this water stress belt that runs across all continents from the Western North America to the Far East Asia, crossing all the longitudes. And this gives an idea of how the problem is diffused, how there is no place, no area in the world that is really non-affected. But at the same time, it also says that there is a part of the world, a large part of the world, where this problem is particularly evident. With this, I thank you, and I pass the floor to my colleague Maya Bertule of UN Environment for the indicator 651.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. My name is Maya Bertule. I'm with the UNEP DHI Center, and I'll speak to one of the indicators under target 6.5. And target 6.5 reads to implement integrated water resources management at all levels by 2030, including transboundary cooperation as appropriate. So you can see one of our key messages on the opening slide here. So 107 countries are unfortunately not on track to achieve the target by 2030. And indicator 6.5.1 measures the degree of implementation of integrated water resources management. I do want to note that in 2020, we received 171 country reports, so a very good turnout considering the year we've had, and roughly comparable with the data set we had in the opening, the baseline year in 2017. Next slide, please. So indicator 6.5.1 measures degree of implementation of Iwrm using a survey questionnaire. And the survey covers 33 various elements of implementation of Iwrm, which are then assessed from very low to very high implementation. Here on the screen, you can see the map of the aggregated indicator results for year 2020. The good news for year 2020 is that we no longer have any countries in the very low implementation category. So 2020 is the first year for that. You can see no reds on the map here. The not so good news for this survey, if we could just go back, please, thank you, is that we still have 87 countries, or roughly half of the countries, in the lower implementation categories, so low and medium low here in the orange and yellow on the screen. So still some work to be done there. Next slide, please. In terms of the rate of progress, and if we're looking at achieving target by 2030, we do see that 44 countries are relatively close to achieving target already as of this year. We also see that 22 countries have made quite substantial progress, and we see this based on the data we have in the baseline year of 2017 and the movement they made across the ladder towards 2020. However, we do see also, based on the progress on indicator over this last 3 to 5 years, that there are still 107 countries that are not likely to achieve the target by 2030. And I do want to mention that even though this indicator is based on a survey questionnaire, we do know that for year 2020, most of the countries have employed and made use of stakeholder consultation processes to report on the indicators. So we do have quite high confidence in the data for both years, in fact. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for the indicator on a global level? We have made progress on indicator main score. So we have moved from 49 out of 100 to 54 between these last 3 years. So definitely a progress there. What we do see, unfortunately, is that at this rate of progress globally, we are unlikely to achieve the target of very high implementation of Iwrm by 2030. And in fact, we do need to at least double the rate of advancement of Iwrm globally. This is the key message I would like to relay. And with that, I say thank you. And I would like to pass it over to my colleague Sonia from UNEC to speak of indicator 652. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Sonia Köppel, currently Secretary of the Water Convention at UNECE, and co-custodian with UNESCO. Ali Jareli will speak after me. Overall, 60% of global freshwater flow is in transboundary basins, and therefore it was a great step forward that SDG target 6.5 includes a call for transboundary water cooperation. And that also there is now an indicator which measures the proportion of transboundary basin area within a country with an operational arrangement for water cooperation. However, the second reporting exercise, which we have just carried out, shows that only 24 out of the 153 countries sharing transboundary waters worldwide actually have all their transboundary rivers, lakes, and aquifers covered by operational arrangements for water cooperation. And in addition, only 22 countries have more than 70% of their waters, transboundary waters, covered by operational arrangements. On the next slide, you can see the results by countries. And on the positive side, we can see that there was a very high level of engagement. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic, 129 out of the 153 countries sharing transboundary waters have submitted their reports. And the indicator value is now available for 101 countries. In addition, we have seen progress in that several countries, more countries have actually prepared reports in consultation with basin organizations and with other riparian countries. And also the reporting exercise has actually given, in some cases, the impetus to countries to improve their cooperation, to develop new agreements, or to make existing arrangements operational. As you can see on the next slide, there's, however, a great variance between regions. Europe, North America, and Sub-Saharan Africa show the greatest levels of progress, but also there, significant progress is still needed to achieve the target by 2030. And in Latin America and Asia, much more progress is still needed to improve transboundary water cooperation, despite some notable exceptions. In addition, out of the 310 transboundary surface water basins, at least 128 lack actually any type of transboundary agreements. And I hand over now to Alita Aureli to continue from UNESCO.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you very much. I want to add that what we can see in this slide is an important information. So telling us that the monitoring of the indicator has revealed that there is an insufficient knowledge globally about, in particular, transboundary aquifers and shared groundwater resources. And definitely we are doing our best to make an effort on that. However, via the indicator 652 process, we are now improving the support to countries in order to increase their consideration on groundwater resources. Next slide. This slide shows that there is definitely a crucial need to accelerate cooperation amongst countries for the sustainable governance and management of transboundary waters, both surface water and groundwater. UNESCO and UNECE in these years, and will continue on that in order to accelerate this trend, will improve support to countries for capacity development actions. I give now the floor to the colleague. I will pass over to Stuart Crane from the United Nations Environment Programme.
Thanks a lot, Alice. And hello, everyone. My name is Stuart Crane. Yes, I work with the UN Environment Programme, where I coordinate UNEP's work on SDG 6, and I speak now specifically on indicator 6.6.1. So SDG indicator 661 measures how much of our freshwater ecosystems are changing. And this is important to know because our freshwater ecosystems, and these are our lakes and our rivers and our wetlands and groundwater aquifers, they provide us all with the freshwater goods and services that we need to live and to develop sustainably. And SDG target 66 asks that countries work to protect and restore these valuable ecosystems. And we measure how our surface water bodies are changing over time by using satellite-based Earth observations, which allow us to observe very high-resolution changes to all surface water bodies the world over and over long time periods as far back as the early 1980s. Next slide, please. So what freshwater ecosystem changes are we seeing? Well, if we look back over just the last 20 years of data at surface water changes within all of the world's river basins, we find that in the last 5-year period, we are observing very dramatic changes to our available surface water in over 1/5 of the world's basins. Next slide, please. And on this global map, the two colors to pay attention to are the light blue. And these areas represent river basins that have experienced high increases in their surface water area in the last 5 years. And these high increases correspond to areas that are experiencing flooding, growth in reservoirs, and also very newly inundated or flooded land. And then the yellow areas on the map represent river basins showing rapid declines in surface water area. And this is indicating the drying up of lakes, the drying up of our wetlands, our floodplains, and drying up of our seasonal water bodies. And many of these observed changes may also be indicative of climate change, which we think is accelerating the drying out of lakes in the arid regions and the expansion of lakes from increased glacial melting and increased rainfall. Next slide, please. And one particularly important subset of freshwater ecosystems are wetlands. And these inland wetlands, such as peatlands, as well as coastal mangroves, have experienced a persistent decline over the last 100 years, with an estimated 80% of wetlands entirely lost already. And on this graph, you can see the direction of change for wetlands quite clearly. And wetland ecosystems provide a number of important roles, such as trapping carbon from the atmosphere, locking it into the ecosystem, and protecting coastal areas from storm surges, but also retaining floodwater. So that's the big picture, global state and direction of change of our freshwater ecosystems. And to reverse the global trend, countries are going to have to act very quickly to restore those ecosystems that are lost and degraded and protect those that are still in a good state. Okay, that's it from indicator 661. I'm going to hand over to my UN colleague, Bruce Gordon from WHO.
Thanks so much, Stuart. And I just want to acknowledge that WHO is co-custodian partnering in reporting on these two means of implementation indicators with OECD. So these are the last two indicators that we're going to report on. And what's, important and interesting is that these are essentially answering the question, do we have the resources and the mechanisms to actually reach the SDGs? So the first one deals with international cooperation, which is really, I'm going to, in the next slide, and maybe you can switch to the next slide, is looking at official development assistance. And the message is very clear here. We have very ambitious goals for WASH and across the water domain and sanitation domain. And we would have liked to have seen a step change in international aid and in government financing, but there's little change in disbursements and a slight increase in ODA. So we're going to have to look very hard at those figures, considering some of the data that we've been hearing, including that we need, as we heard from Rick, a fourfold increase in some of the most basic service provision to get to where we need to be for universal access. Next slide, please. So this is where aid is going. You'll see in pink that 1/3 of aid is going to sub-Saharan Africa. So that's receiving the largest ODA disbursements for the water sector. The disbursement to sub-Saharan Africa increased from US 2.8 billion in 2015 to US 3.1 billion in 2019. I should note all these figures are for the year 2019, pre-pandemic, and they will be very interesting to see as we get the data from 2020 to see how the world responded in funding to the pandemic. Next slide. So look, the next indicator is local participation. So this is the official target language, is supporting and strengthening the participation of local communities and improving water and sanitation management. This is from the GLASS report in 2019. Currently, we are about to embark on a full data collection update, and this will be featured in the next GLASS report in Q3 2022. Next slide. Again, a big message here is that a very small number of countries have what we're calling high levels of participation and user and community participation. So that really means, by our definition, collaborative management and decision making. So having an input into decision making. Most countries report medium levels of user and community participation, which is just a consultation process, but not necessarily significant inputs. Next slide, please. So again, a map, this is a deeper dive into how participation of local communities has been sort of implemented its status with respect to subsectors. So this is sort of a bit complex, but we've looked at urban drinking water and rural drinking water, urban and rural sanitation, hygiene and water resource management. And you'll see here, the sort of the lighter blue means that all 5 or 6 of those subsectors do have some participation policies or laws in place. And you'll see they're also in many difficult countries with many challenges, or I should say countries facing difficult challenges on WASH. So you'll see in the next slide that the policies and laws in place, don't actually necessarily give rise to good implementation because of the very extreme resource limitations that countries are reporting. So 6 in 10 countries are reporting that human and financial resources were less than half of what is required to support the community participation. So that kind of links back to the first indicator. So I think that concludes all of our reports, the agency reports on SDG 6 indicators. I'm going to pass it on. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bruce. And thanks so much to everyone else presenting. And thanks so much to all you participants who are still hanging in. I hope you've been able to respond to these quiz questions. And if not, you still have like a minute or so to do so. There is a lot of information and a lot of numbers, but they are indeed very important. So we really hope that you take the time to read the reports afterward in peace. You can also find data on all the SDG 6 indicators for all countries and regions. We should change the slide too. For all countries and regions at the SDG 6 data portal. So here you can, for example, visit your country snapshot to see how your country is doing on SDG 6. And we also ask you to please share these findings with everyone in your network, and perhaps even your non-water friends and family would be interested to know how their countries are doing on water and sanitation. And as you notice, the focus of this session is really on the current status, what the data tells us. 2.3 billion people lack access to a hand washing facility with soap and water. So let's see how you're doing. Half of you have responded correctly on this. It's 2.3, but it was confusing because the other numbers are actually those on drinking water and sanitation. So need to keep track of that. 2.3 billion, it's 1/3 of the world population. The next question, it's actually exactly the same. It's 2.3 billion people that live in water-stressed countries. And that's a country that use more than 25% of the available water resources. This third quiz, the correct answer is that 1 out of 5 river basins are experiencing rapid changes indicated of flooding or drought. And here, and when you do, please make sure to unmute yourself. And if your internet connection allows for it, it would also be very nice if you could put on the video to make it a bit more personal. If you want to ask a question in French or Spanish, that's also fine. But instead of taking the floor, we then ask you to please post your question in the chat so that we can read it up in English for everyone's benefit. And since we have very little time and many people that may want to speak, please limit your intervention to no more than 1 minute. And I also ask my UN colleagues to stay alert because there will be questions coming your way. And with that, I open the Q&A. Are there any questions? And I'm trying to locate there.
Hey, Maria.
Yeah.
This is John Oldfield. Just a quick question. Thank you all for your presentations here. What is the overall plan, if there is one, for these data being communicated to governments in the developing world and in the developed world so that actions can be taken based on this data? Thank you.
Yes. So I'll respond to that since it's cross-cutting. These data are coming from the countries in the beginning, and all the data have been validated by the countries, so they are very much aware of it. Of course, at the global level, we are communicating this, but also to the individual countries. We have that's one of the reasons why we really did this SDG6 data portal, so that anyone within the countries can look at their exact situation. And then the custodian agencies are working with their country focal points to also take it like the next step, looking at data use for policy. And we're also in contact with the UN country teams to like facilitate their use of this data. So I hope that responds to your question. Anyone else? Come on, please. Let's make it interactive.
Maria, I could come in just for a moment here, if you would like.
That's great.
Because I think John asked a really interesting question. And I think, I mean, there's the question of how do we communicate? And then there's also the question of what do we communicate with these messages? Because I think, as everyone just saw, I mean, there is a lot of information to absorb. And I would think that many in our audience would sort of be juggling, you know, just a plethora of ideas, of information. And in some ways, I think we need to think collectively about filtering that and about prioritizing those. And just to give you one example from Rick's presentation, we made a hard decision this year to actually communicate projections to 2030. So it wasn't just, you know, we have a big problem now. There's you know, X billion people without services. This is what the world will look like with a business as usual projection. So I think that there's a lot in that question that John asked. And I think really we need to think about that from a few different perspectives, including the how and the what. Over.
Thanks, Bruce. We have a question from Antoinette Kome. Would you want to take the floor?
Yes, hi everybody. My name is Antoinette Kome from SNV from the Netherlands. I just wanted to ask a general question, because I noticed that some of the indicators have more representative data than others, right? Some indicators depend on a very few countries reporting or limited data. And of course, when you're starting to make projections and you're starting to show that we won't make it, that may be an unwelcome message for some countries. And then if some of the data are easily questionable because they're not representative, that sort of undermines then the whole effort. So I wanted to know, what are you doing to make those, to fill those data gaps or to make it more representative?
So maybe if I start by noting that it depends on the different indicators. There's like a general rule that you need to cover a certain percentage of the population to be able to do a global estimate or to do regional estimates. But I'm happy to have someone from the agencies give a more specific explanation what they are doing to correct for missing data. So Graham, will you start, and then Alicia?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for both of those questions. Very, very relevant and very, very important. I think the thing is that, you know, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of work that this exercise that we've all been doing from the different agencies has led to at the country level. I mean, you know, national monitoring, right? Global monitoring is all about good national monitoring. So the more we can do, we've been doing, many of us doing a lot of capacity building at the local level to try and find new ways of encouraging countries to report at the global level. And I mean, particularly for the indicator that we've been working on wastewater, we've been doing a lot of work with water utilities and working out how to mine their data sources in order to encourage that data to be used to make national estimates. So there's a lot to be done, and my indicator is one of the ones actually with the last person who asked the question. We have very little data. You can see only 14 countries have reported on industrial wastewater. It's also led to some partnerships with other organizations, and Habitat has an arrangement with another group called CDP, where industries are voluntarily encouraged to report on wastewater that they discharge. So it's basically about bringing the different bits of the jigsaw together and trying to use that data in an aggregated way to improve the precision and accuracy of the estimates that we're trying to make. So it's a bit of an uphill struggle, but it's something that's worth doing, and the interest in the work is increasing. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Alicia?
No, thank you for the question. Definitely, the answer is not the same for each one of the indicators. I mean, each indicator has its own specificity. For which concern the CIS-52, that is the monitoring of transboundary waters, so shared waters, and in particular the consideration of the existence of an operational agreement on these waters. I would say that that there are very good signals, in the sense there are 153 countries worldwide that share or an aquifer system or a lake or a river. And we have received recently, for this last report, 129 countries report. So the interest of the countries to be supported, to be helped, to be to receive UN support in improving their knowledge on transboundary water is there. Why we don't have 153 or 129 indicators? Because there is a lack of knowledge, as we said, on the science, on the hydrogeology, on the measuring of the quantity and quality of these international rivers, international lakes, and in particular transboundary aquifers. So it is tremendously helpful what we are doing, because 129 countries is now asking support through the UN to international cooperation, to donors, and we are improving, and we know where we have to go for the acceleration of this process in order to provide training, to provide capacity, to develop knowledge and capacity for achieving the target. Of course, it's a long term.
Thanks, Alicia. There's a lot of agencies wanting to respond, but I think we will prioritize the participants. Eunice Atafua, would you like to take the floor?
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So I want to find out what measures are put in place to verify the information that the different countries give with respect to the different targets, because who knows, they may be given a different information from what is reflected on the ground. So I want to know what kind of means is used to confirm or verify the information given by the various countries. Thank you.
Yes, so I will just again say that it varies across the indicators. The agencies have some verification mechanisms put in place, and there's a lot of consultations with the countries back and forth to end up with the final number. But maybe Ricardo would like to respond to that question.
Okay. Well, the point of the verification of the data is of course a very important part of the work that you do in the agencies. I think all of us. In fact, the only way, or at least the most viable way to do so, is to compare the data that comes every year with the data that we already had, and to discuss with the countries when those data do not match. In in other ways, with other options that we have is to, for example, to put the data that we get from countries with other data that we may get, for example, from satellite, to see if there is a correspondence, if there is a contradiction, if the two different sets are plausible or not. These are the means that at least we at FAO put in place to verify the data.
So maybe thanks so much. And maybe just to add that you speak about the water resources data on water.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks. There are 2 questions in the chat. I'm trying to navigate multiple windows here. Or actually, I'll call on my colleague Will to read up the questions in the chat.
Okay, thanks, Maria. And just a request, it seems like everyone has the ability to pause the recording. It's a bug with Zoom, so just be very careful that you don't do that by accident. The first question is from Carlos, and he asks, regarding indicator 6A, financial resource availability is one of the conditions to increase action to achieve the goal toward 2030. How can developing countries speed the access to climate funds to reduce water vulnerabilities across all levels and sectors related to water? Maybe this is a question for Bruce.
Thanks, Will, and thanks. It's a really great question. I think it's one that the water sector has been struggling with for some time. And certainly within WHO, we have a climate change team, and we often talk about accreditation for the GCF and how we can, and this whole question of trying to in some ways differentiate what is kind of day-to-day wash or water development work and what has a specific climate angle. And I think the two actually come together, and it's a difficult question. So I actually don't have an answer other than to say I think it is seen by many in our sector as an untapped resource, the climate funds. I don't think many funds go to water. And I think we need to continue our discussions to try to get into a space beyond, the one that I reported on in 6A. Because it's frankly, as you noted, as we all noted, it's simply not enough. And a lot of all our agencies programming and country programming now is with that climate resilient lens. So I apologize for being a bit vague there. Maybe others have a better, more spicy answer. Over.
Thanks, Bruce. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, so there's one more here. So this is from Elizabeth White. Following on the discussion about whether the different countries notice information, and she's referring to the data, the results, whose responsibility is it to work toward or achieve these goals? And maybe I can make a first attempt on this one. So as Maria said in the very beginning, the Agenda 2030 was signed up to by all member states of the world. So this is actually a binding commitment on the part of the member states to develop their own local levels of ambition for these global goals and then to deliver them. And this reporting mechanism is how they're accountable. But it's a long path, and a big part of this is the institutional development in the country. And if you look back just 5-6 years ago, SDCs weren't that well known, and we were building on the MDGs, which really did not have a complete global scope. So there's a bit of a path on raising awareness and getting things kind of institutionally internalized in as many countries as possible. What we've seen in the last few years is that more and more countries than before have dedicated SDG departments in the governments. More and more often, these are kind of centralized cross-cutting departments rather than being siloed in one particular ministry. And as Maria showed with the results from the data collection in 2020, we're seeing more success in the number of countries that are providing data. But what's challenging in terms of getting it used is that these are global, these are estimates at the national level that are aggregated regionally and globally. That doesn't necessarily make them useful for national level or subnational level policymaking. So a lot of what we're doing, now, but even more in our upcoming phase, is going to be working with the countries on how to translate these numbers into meaningful national and subnational policy tools. And a lot of that's going to come down to how we can disaggregate the data. One of the forms of disaggregation we're looking into right now, for example, is how to reflect, how to interpret these indicators through the gender lens, as an example. If we can do that, that makes it a lot more relevant for certain aspects of policy. So that is a really good question about who's responsible for these goals and how do we empower them to make meaningful policy decisions based on this data. If you don't mind me answering that question.
Yeah, thanks, Will. So are there anyone else who wants to speak? Anyone sharing examples from their countries on how they use the data? Would be great to hear some more voices. Otherwise, I'll ask my colleagues in the agencies if there's anyone else who want to respond to the question about the responsibility. Actually, there is one. Björn Olsson, please take it.
Yes, I'm a moonlight farmer just outside Stockholm, but I was in South Africa a few years ago and was working on a assessment on an intervention, and I was thinking at the time, would the local government or the regional government look at figures like we have been seeing now and react upon them?
Thanks.
That's
So,
my simple question. Yeah.
So maybe it's worth highlighting that depending on the indicator, I mean, some are basically local data that's aggregated up to the national level. So in some cases, the data are actually coming from the local levels, whereas others are, for example, 661 on Earth observation, it's really, the definition of top down. But yes, the question is also if they want to, like these indicators, how useful they are at the local levels. And I think the main, one of the main benefits of the global indicators is that they're great for communication. It's like one value per country, and it makes it easier to communicate, broad progress. But to make actual decisions at the ground, it's clear that it's a great need for disaggregated data and many additional data sets. I see that my colleague Tom from UNICEF also would like to respond.
Good.
Tom? Yeah.
Thanks, Maria. I think this is a very good question, and one of the things we've been trying to do is to integrate these new measurements into national monitoring systems. So, for example, the WHO UNICEF JMP team has been supporting the integration of water quality testing into household surveys, which has allowed us to collect information on fecal contamination across a large number of countries. I think we've supported over 30 surveys so far. In countries which have not previously had any information about drinking water quality, this is extremely powerful. If you collect information in a household survey, then you're able to disaggregate it right down to lower levels of government and also by different socioeconomic groups, and to really understand who is most affected within a given country. So the data that are starting to come back now are very compelling. In our last report, we highlighted some of those. And in some countries, we're seeing that less than 20% of the population are actually using drinking water sources that are free from contamination. In some cases, over 40% of the population are actually drinking very high risk drinking water. So there are ways in which disaggregated data collected through national monitoring systems can be extremely useful for informing policy and programming responses. Thanks.
Thank you.
That's great. So we have like a few minutes left. I don't know if one of the other agencies would like to speak to this question.
Maria,
yeah.
Maybe I can just make a few notes on indicator 651. I mean, this is maybe a slightly different indicator because it's really looking at the integrated nature of a lot of the policy management instrument arrangements. But we found that it has been very helpful to also have, and because of the nature of the reporting, the survey, we've had a very close interaction with pretty much all the focal points in the country. So a lot of back and forth and discussing, you know, what these scores actually mean on the ground, because that, of course, is very different from country to country. But I think it's been helpful to view this exercise not only as now we have to report, you know, every 3 years, but see that as a productive diagnostic analysis. And we've definitely heard from a lot of the stakeholder workshops that this is useful exercise, not only because we get a number we can now report to the agencies, but we also get sort of opportunity to have a status in the country. So we are, of course, working, I also posted a link in the chat with support program to acknowledge, okay, we cannot jump from 0 to 100 in 5 years on an indicator, but this whole reporting exercise does help to identify even the small things, small steps that can be taken, whether that's in basin organizations, national governments, maybe it's just introducing very specific provisions in the management instruments or policies, just to make these smaller steps along the ladder towards very high implementation. And I think that has been helpful both for us as an agency in seeing that this is actually used, that it is a useful exercise, because it does take a lot of resources to conduct this on national level, but also for the countries to see, okay, we see very specific actions and areas where we could make improvements based on the examples from other countries, for example. So that maybe also goes a bit back to the point on that filling these data gaps is important, not only for the data set, but also for being able to share these experiences and seeing examples. That's from the 651 point of view. Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much, Maya. And Stuart, I think you'll have to respond in the chat because we're running out of time. I thank you all for the questions that we received. We are, of course, interested in continuing this conversation with you. And I just wanted to note that we are running indicator-specific webinars in the 3rd week of September. So for each of the indicators, a more in-depth session. And you're, of course, very welcome to join these sessions, and we will get back to you with more information. And later this year, we're also planning on having a digital global workshop, specifically targeting the different overall and technical focal points in the countries. And with that, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Shmoy McLean, who works at the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation in Jamaica. And before joining this ministry, you were working in the Jamaican NSO, National Statistics Office, and you were actually overall focal point for us. But now since 2018, you are serving on the IMI SV6 Strategic Advisory Group, and we're very grateful for the very valuable advice you're providing to the initiative. And I hand over to you now for the closing statement.
Thank you, Maria. Friends and colleagues, good day. Thank you very much for participating in this event at World Water Week and to celebrate with us the launch of 2021 SDG 6 progress reports. It is great to see so much interest in the progress toward our global water and sanitation ambitions 6 years into the SDG 6 period. As you have seen, for the first time, we have data from almost 200 countries, which is a major accomplishment for the international community. However, these numbers sadly confirm the tendency we first saw in 2018. We are off track and we need to dramatically accelerate. We're living in a time when the impacts of climate change on water and sanitation will call for collaboration across sectors in the production of accurate, timely, and disaggregated data. Last year, the SDG 6 Global Acceleration Framework was launched to mobilize action across governments, civil society, the private sector, and the UN, and to better align efforts, optimize financing, and enhance capacity and governance. The framework is founded on 5 accelerators. The first is optimized financing. Improved targeting, better use of existing resources, and mobilization of additional domestic and international funding will lead to more efficient service delivery and implementation. In countries, costed plans to deliver SDG 6 need to be fully funded. Next, we have improved data and information. Data generation, validation, standardization, and information exchange are vital to build trust so leaders can make informed decisions and increase accountability. Through the Integrated Monitoring Initiative, we aim to ensure that high-quality information on SDG 6 indicators is accessible to any decision maker. And as you have seen in the introduction to the session today, the Integrated Monitoring Initiative intends to use the data it has assembled to achieve 2 things. First, to encourage national and subnational data collection, and second, to help policy and decision makers to take informed action. The third accelerator is capacity development. Inclusive human and institutional capacities will enable improved service levels, operating and maintenance technology, increased job creation in the water sector, and the retaining of a skilled workforce. The fourth is innovation. Innovative practices and technologies should be identified and then leveraged and scaled up, ultimately leading to improved water resources and sanitation development and management. And the final accelerator is governance. Success in this area will require cross-sector and trans-boundary collaboration, clear rules, stakeholder involvement, and effective and inclusive institutions. SDG 6 needs to be everyone's business. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your participation today and for bringing your enthusiasm and experience to this event. With the conclusion of this event, it is my pleasure to announce the launch of the 2021 SDG 6 progress reports. These reports can be downloaded from the UN Water website. We hope that these reports and the other events leading to the 2023 conference on water will generate political will and global movement for water and sanitation. We also encourage countries and stakeholders to join us by registering efforts on the SDG 6 action space. The links for the reports, SDG 6 action space, as well as the SDG 6 data portal are available on your screens and in the chat box for this event. Thank you. Have a good remainder of your day and stay safe. The event is now closed.